Before discussing ideas regarding bid'ah and common mistakes by Shaykh Muhammad S. Adly, it's important to define some terms. Sunnah is a way or tradition. Bid'ah is that which is beyond it. Innovation sounds too positive to understand what's going on there. We'll talk about that later. Hadith is a saying or event. So the first thing we need to remark is that not every time somebody says sunnah or hadith, they will be talking about what was revealed to Prophet Muhammad, what Prophet Muhammad taught. But that's what we're going to get into too, because we can't just say, oh, it was the way of the Arabs or something like that. Like a lot of people say that about the Islamic tradition in general. They say, oh, it's an Arab proverb, and it's like, but who said it? Some things are arrangements of inspired sayings and Quranic verses that the Prophet himself used. Others are by others. So one way to have that sinful innovation is to mess up the attributes. What's required, what's forbidden. Is it recommended or voluntary or required? There's a lot of switching back and forth that people do with those. If you know what you were doing is outside of the bounds of the religion as it is taught for this time, or you're encouraging such an individual in that, you share of the same fate. This is an accursed thing for you doing. Now, if you have messed up in your behavior or your belief, and you realize that, and then go on, it can be as if you've never done those things in the first place. Some people will look at the first 3 or 4 generations in this era as a source of justification. I myself want to look straight at what the prophet of this age taught, what was revealed to him, what he was inspired to say and do, and use that as my justification. Because certainly material culture and psychological culture and language and stuff can vary over time. But what we look at early on will tell us, what is actually considered acceptable worship in Islam. And it is important to revive the traditions that have come across of what seems to be authentic of what the Prophet taught. Now, one of the sources of Islamic law is the way of the believers. So do they actually all agree, or are they just saying, oh, this one school of thought has said this, so therefore this scholar has said this? Or people look at Albani or somebody and say, well, what about their judgments about which hadith were sound and all that? And it's like, well, there's still authentic narrations that might not be sound, or maybe there's a reason to not reject all the narrations that they reject. So I think that Dar es Salaam should publish the full books. Releasing edited books that exclude some of the narrations, I don't think is the right approach, because maybe include a footnote where it says that there's some people that have graded this weak or whatever, but even a weak narration is stronger than what you'd expect from the Bible. You don't know who wrote those. Some 2nd century Matthew, Mark, and Luke. some John in the 90s wrote the book of Revelation and the Gospel of John based on some older stuff. And the writings of Paul admit and his buddies kind of indicate very strongly that they were less inspired than the original book of Revelation. The only thing in the New Testament that can seem like it might have come through direct spiritual experience was the book of Revelation. But the book of Revelation, again, was a rewrite. So, and the other books, whether they were rewrites or stuff done and edited much later, it's like a weak hadith, as far as Islamic tradition is concerned, by the time it made it into the Big Ten in particular, or the secondary 40, are, one of hundreds of others of collections that were okay and not totally rejected. Again, we're looking at stronger material than most traditions would allow. Even if you see people that aren't dressed properly, even if you see people who are changing their faces and all that sort of stuff, you can still address them as to, hey, here's some corruptions and stuff that happened, and we need to rectify them. If you start a tradition or a way, just like if you encourage what's already going on, you get credit for that. And so whether it's good or bad, again, that accrues to you. And even if it's not changing the spiritual status of it, don't go advocating for the legalization of drugs or whatnot, or whatever other behavior that's not considered appropriately religiously in the legal sphere. Like, certainly we know that alcohol is connected to most major mental illness and most major crime, even in countries where, not every country where it's not legal, but, even in countries where it's not legal, you still find out that it's connected to that and other drugs to that effect. Yes, the idea of putting somebody in prison for 5 years or whatnot, that's not right. But the idea that, just let it be legal, no, that's not quite the right answer. Islamically, we could say that, the people of the book were allowed what they did in their ceremonies as long as they weren't abusing anybody or that sort of thing. We didn't allow forced marriages when we ruled. When we talk about the verses that say that God is in or above the heavens, it's not limiting God to only be there. So when people talk about an omnipresent God, I don't think Mr. Adly is making an argument that holds water that that's the case. Now, God's not the creation, so therefore, even in that, if we say God is in the heavens, we're not saying that the heavens somehow contain or limit God either. So, again, when some people will associate the prophets with God. Certainly, they are a way, a truth, and a light for their time, but their knowledge, their power, their ability comes through God. So it's not, that they are one of the lights of the throne or something like that. It's like, no, this is just something made up. And some of the stuff, it wasn't meant to be taken literally. It's in Sufi poems and teaching stories. And they even say some of Imma said stuff in poetic ways that weren't quite meant to be taken as literally as people might think. Some people will reject the narrations about revivers every, century. Our final end-time reviver of the lineage of that Prophet Muhammad was part of. And there'll be other things about the end times that people will reject, and that's also a type of sinful innovation. Now, it's not just that we sit around and write some books about the seven-headed dragon or some of the stuff that a lot of the Christian groups do. We're not supposed to be doing that either. but we're certainly not supposed to reject the aspects of the end times. We are supposed to believe that God sent prophets to give us the perfect belief. We're supposed to believe that the consequences are something that people are trapped in. Like, people get this idea, it's, oh, well, hellfire is just a limited thing. And I've heard sermons given, not from Muslimin, but from Christians, where they said, oh, well, if we're sent to hell, then we're just going to be dipped, or we're just going to be there a short time. And it's like, okay, even if that was true, you're trapped there in some utter horror. Even the Bible kind of dumbs it down a little bit. But the Quran gives such detail that it's like, oh, you don't even want to be dipped. If your feet are dipped to the point where it boils your brain, yeah, that's not what you want to be exposed to at all, even if you're going to get out of it. And of course, there is that narration that for the people of hellfire, there will be no death. Now, of course, death is at a point as that's going to be shown. And of course, death is the thing that, because people think, oh, well, when I die, this will be over with. And people even commit suicide with that idea. It's like, oh, well, when death comes, then such and such will be over. And even the people who will take that, some people make their life so much worse by trying. One of the things is that Islam does not accept anything other than Islam as, the right religion. But in saying that, everything that's good and everything that's true, all condemnation of the bad thought, the bad word, the bad deed, that is Islamic. So, whatever portion that exists in other paths or people. But this idea that, that people will not be required to claim the right faith after the right faith has been revived, that just doesn't make sense. And it also doesn't make sense to excuse those who will look at the news stories and it's like, well, they're not quoting the passages of the scripture that supposedly justify this stuff. And it's like Islamic terrorism, for example. People are afraid of Islamic terrorism, and it's like, what Netanyahu promoted in 1984, was made the official spokesman of that piece of propaganda. And you find out that all these groups, because of the movement that guy was a part of, the Z's, all these terrorist groups after that were suicide bombings, all sorts of stuff were part of the influence of that group. So it just doesn't make sense if the Zionist or what you're looking at, right? Put the blame where it needs to be put, right? And that being said, Islamic rule is not about forcing everybody to live an Islamic life. So therefore, people can disbelieve. They can disobey to certain extents. If they're not hurting anybody else physically or something, then, the government kind of stays out of it, right? Just like is indicated in Surah 49, verse 2, the opinions that you have, you got to make sure not to raise those opinions over the Prophet. Yes, use philosophy, but philosophy's methods, not quoting some scholar or something like that. So, it would be the same thing if we just quote people in Islamic history. It's like, oh, well, they said it. Our philosophy should be about confirming, observing, practicing Islam. If revelation and inspiration is actually divine, then what deity has sent is fine literally. So all these figurative explanations Well, some of them can be fine. They should be based on knowledge, as Surah 3:7 indicates. But the thing about that is that you still can take them literally. We are not people that have amulets or charms. And as far as seeking blessings from the obedience and the practices of pilgrimage and all that sort of stuff, yeah, sure, we can seek blessings. There are different motivations that are entirely appropriately spiritually, but people will do weird things like walk backwards and wipe their backs on things and or maybe take a cloth and not to clean off the place or whatever, but go and take. You'll see videos of people on pilgrimage that will wipe over the stone, not to get it a little cleaner or whatever, but as some sort of thing to get blessings. Now, people can visit the graveyards to remember. They can do a lot of things, but there's a lot of things that they shouldn't do. They shouldn't be praying to the dead or through the dead. They shouldn't circumambulate the graves. They shouldn't make big graves. That doesn't mean they tear down the big graves that people have made. But, basically the idea is like a diagonal across the hand in one of the narrations as far as the gravestone. We're supposed to believe that Al-Quran, and of course any other revealed scripture by God, we don't believe in, per se, the traditions of a lot of this stuff that we hear about, but we believe in the prophets and the messages that they received. So that is the speech of God. Now, some people will say that means it's not created, as therefore, well, if the speech does something, that doesn't mean that it's co-eternal or all that with God. And then you would say, well, if the universe was put into being that way, and then you'd have to make that argument about the universe if you're going to follow that logic. So I just don't, whatever. But that the very thing we believe, kind of like speech, is a quality of God almost, or not almost. So yeah, we believe in the Word of God, but not the Christian twist of that doctrine. Certain groups are closer to rightly believing and rightly acting than others, but that doesn't mean that your brothers in faith are those that rejected the prophet of this age. Now, Adam, the universe, etc., were created in their image, but, the universe in its image, humanity in humans' images belonging to God. God has the idea and speaks into this done, or that sort of thing. So we don't believe that God is like anything in anything, as the verse says. So therefore, all this stuff where people say, "Oh, well, Adam's like God" and all that, it's like that's not really what we believe. That people look like divinity. Let's not resist the labels that divinity has put forth. And so when we're told that if somebody has abandoned a salat, that they are not Muslim, if they neglect, okay, they're whatever, but if they're worshiping other than God, sometimes there's confusion about that sort of stuff. But, if they're actually praying to Muhammad or some of his family or some saint or some angel or something like that, or through them, well, then they're not Muslim. Certainly those who haven't accepted Muhammad as a prophet wouldn't be considered that. So, labeling things appropriately, but not like, the people of the book will call people infidels and Gentiles and pagans and heathen, goyim, apostates, whatever. You got to use words rightly, and it's not just you know, oh, we happen to be of a different group. The things are a bit more literal than that we should use. And certainly we don't blaspheme other groups. That's not appropriate. Now, some things could have been figured out later, but we are told that there would be a gradual breakdown in the concentration of how good the people were. And we definitely see that after a certain point, sort of the point where people talk about the so-called golden age of Islam, where even the so-called Muslim nations were persecuting the Muslims. I'll go over to that more elsewhere, right? Now, people don't become angels, no matter what meaning of the term angel you give to it, right? They don't actually become separate devils or something like that. They don't become the fire beings. They don't become the light beings. Now, angel, again, it's an English word. It means the malaika and the jinn, but the jinn they weren't malaika, and the malaika, and vice versa. So they weren't, and they're not becoming one or the other. The clay beings are the clay beings, whether they're incarnate in physical bodies or not. So that's something to, and God judges us based on what we do, what we choose. So there's none of this one race or gender above another in that respect. The Quran necessitates that Muhammad was the last exemplar prophet to come. The Hadith indicate that he was the last messenger prophet to come. So therefore, the two types that are specifically for other people, that as, so anybody who comes after saying, oh, they're the reincarnation of the Messiah or the new Messiah or the new prophet or any of that stuff. First of all, if you look at it, it's like, how is it necessary? Oh wait, the Ahmadiyya, God sends a prophet to tell you to follow the Quran, just like the Latter-day Saints. Their version of Christianity has, it's an attempted revival of what happened before the Catholics, but let's be real here, that except for a few of those people, nothing ever was there except, oh, well, I was just very devout and worked my way up the church. And yeah, God doesn't have prophetic authority put over people just so they can be the official learners and teachers of what anybody can pick up and understand clearly, right? Now, I don't think there's anything saying that we can't re-experience things or have our own experience of some of this stuff, but it's just not, it's not in that way that's, like a lot of people will say about their sheikhs. Mushayikh, I guess, is the plural that you want to use with that. They will say stuff along the lines of, oh, it's just so much easier to understand through the teachings of such and such. And it's like, that's just not the route we should be taking, right? Now, one thing that people get wrong as far as the washing for the prayer is that if you haven't gone to the bathroom or anything like that, you don't have to rewash those parts when you go to wash up for the prayer. There is no special supplication for every part of things. Very simply to start, very simply to end. Now, I understand if there's dirt on your neck, but you don't have to always wipe over your neck. You wipe over your beard, or if you're a woman or a child, your bare chin. But yeah. Now, people may do things dramatically or whatever, but, things like, oh, this is something at a place and this and together and that sort of stuff. So people coming up with their own odd greetings and stuff like this is generally something to watch out for, isn't it? If you touch something that's unclean, well, you can just wash your hands or wipe your leg or whatever. And there's also the thing about, like, if you're not allergic, if it's a dry dog and you're dry, whatever, just leave it. Or a dry pig and you're dry, and yeah, you can just leave it. Now, don't seek out difficulties with some things. If you can use warm water, use warm water. If you have to use cold water, you have to use cold water. It may be good to go over things repeatedly, but one of the things that you should do is that you should realize that if you've gone over things once, whether the ablutions or the full bath, that should be sufficient. Now, there's the practice of the initial prayer call. And when this is the dawn prayer, well, there's a false dawn. And in some areas, where that tradition is practiced, there'll be an announcement when those little vertical streaks appear to give people time to finish their prayer and finish their meal before the other one, before the other prayer call starts. But only that initial prayer call at the false dawn is where you say prayer is better than sleep. Now, if people are going to be hearing an indication that it's time to wake up for prayer, it should be through the prayer calls, not people chanting loudly Quran or remembrance or any of that other stuff. Certainly, some areas they will blast the Quran so people can't sleep at night, and it's like if it's voluntary, it's voluntary. Don't force anybody to do it or any of that. Certainly not this stuff where people go around banging tambourines and drums and all that stuff in the middle of that to get everybody up. The person giving the prayer call does not say out loud the responses that could be said for the prayer call. Be temperate about your length of the prayer call and your prayers, and these things where you kiss scriptures and place things on your head and make weird gestures with your thumbs and all that stuff. At the very least, know that it's not really of recommended behavior. Now, with all these recordings and stuff, you still should read your own Quran. You should still say your own prayer. You should still make the same calls for prayer and stuff like this. Now, there's been talk in some places where the volume is so abusively loud that across the street with your windows and doors shut, it's still plenty loud in your home, and you just can't handle it's like, okay, and then that's the fault of the people doing it. But as a rule, this thing where you're following along by broadcast or through the wall, and it's not, because the women are on one side, or, it's filled up to a point where people are filling different rooms and they're praying in different rooms. It should be, the leading and practicing of these things directly. Now, just like the Bible says about Jesus and the others, the prayer is according to the prophetic example. So therefore, one should try to figure out what that prophetic example is. And we have all this technology. It's like, okay, yes, try to get out your devices to find the exact direction, but don't use counters and all that stuff. Even when it comes to the non-mechanical, well, I guess if you're holding beads in your hands and letting that turn, it's like if you lose track, you lose track. But you should be conscious enough that you shouldn't need one of those light up prayer mats that kind of indicate where you are or something like that. Oh well, no, it's on blue, so I'm in my third bow of the prayer or whatever the thing is, or one of those people. You could buy sound rooms or kits to make a sound room that would have the prayer stuff on the wall, and there were, you could hire somebody to put in one of these things, and it's like, oh no, just do what you can and learn as you go along. If you're reading off the walls. Now, there is such as being careful of who you are leading that sort of thing. You know, 17 minutes, half an hour for the obliged prayers every day, or whatever. Um, but not, you shouldn't be hasty. The people going to and leading the prayer shouldn't be fitting in with styles um, of the fascist or the feminist or whatever else with their clothes and dress. That doesn't mean they have to dress like they're from Africa. Certainly when the weather is hot, that stuff is really actually kind of better. But, it's not about dressing like one country or not another. And some stuff is good, some supplications and all that is good, but, you don't have to do it after everything. Like, and honestly, you can pick it up later as somebody's like, okay, we have time for the prayer and then we got to go. You can, count out your tasbih while you're not sitting down, that sort of stuff. It is important to stay to a schedule, but if there's somebody who clearly knows more Quran and all that stuff, or somebody who's been made the regular person to lead the prayer, you should generally wait for that person. If there's multiple prayer calls for the Friday prayer, then those should be done in different places. It's not that you hear one and then you hear the other and all that. So I've been places where you hear multiple prayer calls, and it's like, is it time to? No, it's not time for them to start. But it should only be done at the masajid when they're starting the prayer. Between the two sections of the sermon, the supplication or whatever is done, to oneself. It's not really as collective as it tends to be like at the end of the sermon. Now, if people have teachings or whatever after a prayer or whatever, that's fine, but we need to make clear that the classes or whatever that people may hold at that time are not, obligations. Always make sure to indicate that things aren't obligations when they're not obligations, that people should know what these things are. The congregational prayers are it. So when you, the ones that are obliged, so there's not extra prayers like on Friday, instead of the early afternoon prayer, we have the Friday prayer that is after the sermon, but you need to get there before the sermon starts. Or pray 2 bows when you enter. Now, even if you get there before it starts, it's still a good practice to pray 2 bows, but from my understanding, the narrations only indicate that it became required when somebody missed the start of the Friday sermon. The masajid, mosques, as people like to say, are not the graveyards. So we don't put graves in the masjid. We don't build barriers between the men and women. We don't have different places because of different opinions. I have heard of plans to build a Sufi masjid. I've definitely seen how in the Portland area, one of the the earliest registered religious organization in the country, as far as Muslimin, it kept them from having their permanent center longer, and it, stood in the way of the rest of the community having a together center because of their wanting to be separate in their separate groups. So it's one of the masjids of division. So someone even drove me there knowing that I'm not, it's like, why can't you pray there? It's like, it's better to pray in the street than to pray in one of these places. Now, there's that passage in Surah 9 that backs it up, but logically too. So having different places because of different opinions and all that, no. And we need to respect the rules of a masjid. whether it's a small place or not. We shouldn't have just some ridiculous amount of minarets, or the person leading they don't have a special spot as far as, you don't have to give it a different rug and all that other stuff that some people do. Some people have the pulpit super high. Now I can understand, a few steps is acceptable, but more than that is not considered. You have people like that pray on a whole different level, and there's videos online of the people that lead the prayer sometimes being like on a different, like they're on a stage and everybody else is down, um, and even people end up falling because they have to climb up 20-30 steps to lead the sermon. Now, we shouldn't be reserving prayer spots per se. Whoever shows up and moves towards the front and towards the center. There are narrations that maybe we shouldn't have children in the front row, if we have more than a row, but are people who are mentally incompetent as far as, um, but certainly there's not the special spots. Now, some places they'll say, oh, well, only people who've memorized the Quran can be in these couple spots. And it's like, well, okay, that's not really the teaching, but, that it's probably not worth arguing and whatnot over it. Say your piece. It's like, I'm not aware of any support for this, other than what some scholars might say. The Quran and the Prophet doesn't support it, but, and then go your way. I mean, as far as, just, drop it, I guess. Now, one of the things about the masajid was even the stifling of the bells. A lot of people, they come to the masjid and graven images. They might have substances that are not allowed on them, or that they bring with their thing. It's like the early generations did not allow coffee or the caffeinated leaves. They understood when the teaching came down that this was something they didn't engage in, but the Sufis popularized it. Now, some of the Sufi gatherings or whatnot that you say, there are Sufi places that they have a masjid and they have a tekke, or they have a zawiya or something else attached to, because they know that like some of this stuff isn't really for a masjid. Not that all of it's wrong per se, that's just they have the thing, but some of the stuff like birthday celebrations of the Prophet and other extra holidays that they do, and maybe they want to play the drums and all that stuff, and it's like this is just not appropriate for the masjid. And you got to be careful with poetry. Poetry is definitely something that is, well, there's rightful and wrongful stuff that's poetic. Fasting and everything else is according to its rules and observation. So changing that because we're like, oh, well, we can predict the new, we're not talking about the new moon, we're talking about the crescent moon. And so if it's been cited by the Muslims, we need to stop with all the arguments. And people, again, when it comes time to break the fast, if you're able to break the fast, you break the fast. And as far as the extra prayers, but don't require them on people. Some people's like, oh, why do you stop? It's like, but then again, don't disturb the people who are doing extra. One of the problems that people have is like they talk like, oh, it's like, listen, if this period is still here, the best nights of the year, if the best third of that is still around, or some of it is still around, don't talk about, that you can feel it leaving. You can't, because it's not actually leaving. You don't have the sunset starting the next month. Historical visitations are not the same thing as pilgrimage. So we need to be careful not to cut those together, right? When you're on pilgrimage, know what are the actual requirements and recommendations and all that for the pilgrimage. Don't fight over not getting as close to a spot as one may want. And of course, as far as pilgrimage, there's the required one at Mecca, the greater and lesser of that. You can go to Medina, you can go to Jerusalem, but there aren't other places, so we need to make sure not to, some people say, oh, they'll come up with whatever. Now, the holiday prayers should be done outside of the masajid, unless something makes it necessary for that to be the case. Like they can't get another place or something like this, but they should try to have another place. And of course, one of the things is the people that for a brief period of time are supposed to stay away from the masjid, well, they are supposed to be able to go to the holiday prayers. The remembrance that you'll hear people chanting at those holiday prayers, that's for the holidays. It's not just when you show up to the service and join in with other people. It doesn't have to be synchronized. And some people will go out of their way and like, it's synchronizing, so therefore we need to do something different. And it's like, that's probably not the thing either, but it's something you do on your own nonetheless. If we shake hands, we do it with the right hand, but like with all the gatherings, there needs to be appropriate mixing if there's mixing. And as far as what's necessary as far as greetings and stuff, it's not as much as people think. So you don't have to hug everybody and all that other stuff. Marriage is about the couple getting married. And people should be moderate in terms of their expectations, whether we're talking dowry or whatever. There shouldn't be bride prices, so nobody should be charging a fee or requiring some sort of great feat done for the family or something to give permission. The guardian protects the interests and the consent. It's not their job to be a gatekeeper. It's like, I don't like this person, so I'm not going to let them... No, that's not how it's supposed to work. As far as the opposite gender relations of one's spouse, they're the same gender as them, but from their family, the same roles still sort of apply. So it's not like, oh, well, it's the brother-in-law or it's the sister-in-law, so therefore they can be alone just the same as if it was their own sister, and that's not how it works. There shouldn't be competitions for extravagances in terms of the marriage and all that. There shouldn't be the casting of spells with silt and all that other stuff, or waving even a Quran over people to protect them from the evil eye and all that. Supplicate to bless them in an appropriate way, but there's limits, and even that is the point. Divorce shouldn't be done during menstruation or post-childbirth, and divorce shouldn't be divorce, to make it a final divorce, as they call it. And divorce shouldn't be, just like marriage, shouldn't be just whatever the state decides. Don't let your relationships like that be decided by the government. Incense and music and all that other stuff is just not required. And it's best to be able to chant scriptures, to chant the prophetic teachings, to make your supplications without the playing of music and all that. And incense, yeah, it can be fine to have incense, but don't think that, for this we have to have this incense and that incense and all this other stuff. And I noticed at a masjid this bag, and the bag was saying stuff on it that was aspects of disbelief, and I'm like, yeah, can I take this part off? Because this is not, you know, and you don't have to come up with some dance or whatever for the different supplications. Now, the universal dances of peace, that branch of the Rohanat order, well, some of the stuff they say proves they're at least not Muslim if you show up to that group. You look at the schedule. Look up the schedule. I think they're in California and North Carolina. I don't know where else they are. That if you look at that, and yeah, but the idea that they're having a different dance with each time, and there's inappropriate touching between the genders, aka, like in the Bible, you don't shake hands and stuff like this. So we're kind of like doing the same. Some will wipe their face after making supplications. Some people say that the narrations for that are not sound, but the narrations exist. The thing that probably actually seems clear is that this is not a thing that was done all the time. So don't think it's a required thing to wipe one's face. But some places you just get in the swing of it because, that's what everybody's doing, and this is what's taught, and then you realize it's like, what's the reference for it? And then nobody knows the reference for it other than it's just people do, and it's like, well, that's an indication that you don't have to do it. So bowing and prostrating is something you have to be careful with. Of course, it's only done in the right direction, and it's done something, you're not bowing before anything that anybody would worship. And it's like, the so-called special occasions and all that. We're not people that are just fall to our knees in public and just drop our bag and bow and that sort of thing. We as part of the prayer or something. But when faced with calamities, we can raise our hands for some extra supplications in the middle of prayers. But we're not supposed to just put our hands upward and downward according to the occasion, and to do the sort of things that you see in some of these magic, by the authority of this and this, and, you can pray to God directly. As you did for this prophet, and there are supplications, there some of that, but in the general sense, you just don't do that. Be careful asking for continuance, and know that God knows your condition. So when you worship properly, if you forget to ask for yourself, that's okay. But certainly it's encouraged to supplicate God via and for one's condition. So that indicates that you can use some of your own words in the supplications. But in general, it is better, Sod wal Qur'anity dhikr. So the Quran's the chief of remembrance. So if you know something Quranic, if you know something prophetic, if you don't know something like that, then... And as far as the sermons that people attend, you do not have to do the supplications. So it's important to know that this is not an always to be done thing. And just like with the prayer itself, don't make the things too long. And just because people take off for the sermon doesn't mean, it doesn't mean that you should make the sermon like, let's just make it super long. It's like, make it a half an hour or so or something. That could be fine. Some less than that. But, how some people will want to make it as long as some of these church services that people go to. Bernie Mac, was it? Had that show, the guy he was talking about, he chose to be Catholic because the Catholics have the shorter church service than the other people. And it's like, that's not what you do either. The revelation and inspiration for this age was in Arabic. The translations are available, but we should go over in Arabic, even if we only have a transliteration. And the treatment of the translations, again, because we know that the translation is not the same thing as the revelation. Perhaps some of the things, certainly religious books have no place in the bathroom or anywhere trashy or whatever, but you don't have to say all the supplications. There's that opinion. when reading the English. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim occurs 114 times in Al-Quran. It's important to not cause the confusion that the chapter might start at a different place by adding it. Start everything in the name of God, certainly, but when you're going to repeat it aloud or make it obvious that that's what you're doing, that probably should not be done in the middle of chapters. Now, with sermons and scripture, you should listen attentively. You shouldn't make a bunch of needless interruptions, even when it sounds religious. Amen is not even Latin, so knock it off with that amen stuff if you're used to that, or yes, Lord, or whatever that you used to say in church. It's not about the traditions of men anymore. This is, you accept the path of what Islam has had to teach, what the prophet of this age has had to teach, and therefore you're affirming all the previous prophets. Now, if you're Muslim and you're reciting Quran or reading Quran, you don't have to say it, that you're confirming the truth of it, that it's the truth from God every time you finish 30th part or the Quran as a whole. This is, it's superfluous. Now, it is mentioned in the Quran that the Quran is a healing, but let's be careful with that. I mean, certainly you take part in the physical medicines and stuff like this that are the best option. And I mean, obviously plants are probably going to be better at first, or eating right or whatever, but this thing where you say this names a number of times, this names a number of times, certainly you may refer to the appropriate subject verse in the Quran for any situation, but the idea where it's a prescription, or particularly those people like they write it and put it in water, or they soak the paper, it's like, no, you leave the text as is. Now, the first chapter of Al-Quran is a panacea, so you can say that for whatever occasion. Well, not whatever occasion, but you know what I mean. Because you go silent with the remembrance when you're enter into the bathroom and all that. Events can be started and ended with supplication. We shouldn't hire professional worshipers. That includes for the graveyards and all that sort of stuff too, because there are places where you can go and somebody's reading the Quran all the time in this mausoleum and that sort of stuff. The special supplications that sometimes are printed at the end of Qurans, well, first of all, it's clear that they're not Quran. And second of all, we need to remember that, this is not you have to. It's a good practice to get into, but, here's this version and that sort of stuff. And some of these supplications, you can kind of say that sort of thing when you're done with reading or reciting whatever portion you're going to recite when you're doing it outside of prayer. Anyways, not even Quran should be used as an amulet or a talisman. Women and others shouldn't be using their religious knowledge and voice of recitation and all that to show off. And they should be, of course, careful about the company that hears them. Because you know how, even if it's the right thing, the singing can stir desire. People make up stuff about the 15th of Shaban. If there is a narration that says that one time that Muhammad visited a graveyard, it was then, well, that doesn't make it a Muslim Halloween. A lot of the special prayers and their attributes that one may hear of are, bogus. They don't have any, they don't have the backup. It's not traced to the prophet or somebody that was official carrier of the tradition of the prophet or something like that. And by that, I mean they're saying it on the authority that this is what the prophet taught them. People aren't saying that because you run into the same problem if you're saying that the first 3 generations, just because they knew the prophet or knew somebody who knew the prophet or knew somebody who knew the prophet, that, automatically there's, they're saying it's based on it should be based on the revelation and the inspiration, not what somebody said, even if they are of the right generation. Bury people in the area they die in. People that are extravagant placement for the dead is, not something that we should be doing either. Just wash the bodies, put them in the ground cheaply. No need for a coffin unless you're forced to by law. None of this breaking down the bodies by smashing or burning or anything else. Certainly some people actually end up, you think they're dead, but they're not. And I've talked about that in my one series, haven't I? Because I read that book about the grave digger. That's not the name of the book. What was the book called? Dealings with the Dead. Don't afflict the survivors with requirements of feasts and all that sort of stuff. And there's no 40-day thing and no year thing. That's Jewish. I mean, it literally are Jewish traditions. And don't have your grave dug before you die. Don't groom the dead. Absentee funerals are something that should be limited. It's not like, oh, well, you missed the funeral, then you pray a separate funeral for them and all that stuff. No. In Islam, we do not believe in the idea of politics that right and wrong is going to be by a vote. There are certain rights that are going to remain regardless, and no ruler or populace is to be allowed to overturn them. People pretend that beliefs can be separated from politics, and no, they can't. So let's just be honest and direct and do what's best for what is right as we can in the opportunity of our voting. And people may see these things differently as far as, oh, it leans more with this candidate and more with that candidate. The opinions may vary with that, so let's not get into disputes about that sort of thing. Those actually changing governments, it should be about aggression and oppression being opposed. So it's not, oh, we want to be in charge. No, it's deeper than that. And we've got to be careful with the special roles and all that stuff, the state funding, the ruling and the ruled still need to act upon Sharia law, the middle path law of God, as people would call it. When you're going to encourage good and forbid evil, this needs to be done with people who would be labeled as of your faith and of other people. And you want to encourage any bit of good and truth that you can and discourage any bit of evil. And certainly the primacy is to get them to drop all those divisions and falsehood in regard to divinity that they may attribute. What we are calling people to is the scripture of this age, what is revealed to Prophet Muhammad, what he was inspired to teach. We're not just saying that we agree with some things that may be in some version of the Bible or the Bhagavad Gita or whatever. This may be a means, but it's not the focus. The focus of the life is away from the... It's not just, well, there's some good things in the adulterated scriptures and otherwise and fragmented scriptures. The point is to call towards the purity for this age. And of course, be careful with all these titles. A lot of people, if you can't even say, oh, I'm a believer, to distinguish yourself from the other people that might be called Muslim, certainly all these blank Muslim, blank Muslim, blank Muslim, whatever. Somebody asks you what your approach is. It's like, okay, I'm a conservative, I'm a fundamentalist, I'm a liberal, I'm a reform. Those are the four types. And no, those aren't political parties. But, one's just Muslim, because people ask, very frequently you'll find people, are you Sunni, what madhab, and all that stuff. And it's like, no, I accepted Muhammad as a prophet, that it wasn't about any of the other stuff. Now, certainly, a perfection of one's own character and behavior is something to work on. And one thing we need to admit is that some things will be associated with groups that aren't inherently part of a group. It's just some sort of popular thing or something that becomes noticed among some people. So you just think, well, if the others aren't stopping it or saying anything and I don't ever notice any of that, then it somehow must be part of the group. So we need to be careful not to follow into the popular and political Islam arguments that are common. Now, the struggle does start with the teaching and the belief and the practice and that sort of stuff. But it does, stretch into the rest of life and making things for all of humanity in more than a way that saying, here's this teaching available. Here are these examples that you can learn from that have been expanding. And as far as some people being limited in knowledge, well, some are. And we need to act based on what we have, but we continually, our whole lives, can seek more. And you never know what adding a little bit here, a little bit there can add up to in one's life. Culture is a filter. Psychology is a filter. They're not something that we should have alliances to in themselves. Certainly cultural holidays and stuff like this. Holidays, we have our holidays. If there's a day off of work, there's a day off of work, but that's not the same thing as a holiday. If we watch something on TV that's available once a year or something like that, we watch something on TV that's available once a year, but we need to be careful with that. And when something's not forced, let's just in general stay away from obeying people, because people are going to end up calling us towards things that are worthless, things that are wrong, and most people on earth are going to do that if we just go along with what they're saying. So let's be careful of what people came up with and otherwise did after the prophet of this age died. If the form of expression of me or anyone else has not been the best, or has not been the best for your type, well, understand the mistake lies with me or them or, but perfection and perfecting is available. People talk about what is radical, but when it seems that the spiritual path, that the right path is radical, then it's time for us to return to what is radical.